All right, I think we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us on Zoom. It's nice to see some familiar faces that we haven't seen in a while and some new ones. So today we have the Advancing Analytics in Children's Hospital panel on self-service analytics. And we're going to hold questions until the end. The panelists will each present their perspective on this topic, and then we will address questions at the end. But please put them in the chat box so that we know what the burning questions are. I believe people have a chance to upvote questions if you particularly like something, or chime in with a comment if you feel you would like to share. And Jennifer and Bridget will address the questions at the end. So let me introduce our panelists. We have Bridget Rauch, who is a data analyst at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia within the Center for Healthcare Quality and Analytics. She serves a very important role there, supporting consistent data delivery for the Department of Pediatrics. So you can imagine she has a lot of customers who deal with a lot of very important data, and she enables those clinical leaders to make data-driven decisions. She's going to talk today about her work and the work at CHOP to roll out self-service analytics and their experience. And Dr. Jennifer Cartland is the Chief Analytics Officer for the Ann and Robert H. Lurie Children's Hospital. Her and her team are the people who helped me have self-service analytics, so I'm very pleased with that. And so Jennifer will talk about the work that she's done to understand what is the need for data literacy and how do we build the tools that people need to be successful with self-service analytics. And so with that, I believe Jennifer will start us off, and then we'll hear from Bridget and we'll take questions at the end. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. Thanks everybody for being here. It's August and it's time for vacation. I think everybody feels that way. So my presentation really comes out of a lot of work we've done because we began our department 6 or 7 years ago thinking we were going to do self-service analytics, and our first attempts out of the gate really failed. And if everybody could just put themselves on mute, that would be terrific. Not everyone's, yeah. So we started really thinking about what it takes to get a self-service analytics working well. One of the things that we started digging into that, and so we started doing a lot of reading and thinking about how analytics are used and how the culture of organizations has really changed, especially in healthcare. Before we had the electronic health record, really nobody ever thought about self-service analytics like we think of them now. But suddenly, because the data exists in some database somewhere, people think, oh, we can pull it out and make a report out of it. So started doing some thinking about why we were failing. And what we started thinking about is we ran across this nice work by the corporate executive board that laid out this, what we really need to have really employees and staff and leaders getting to a point where they're having insight. And my team had spent a lot of time thinking about how to make information more useful, really cleaning it up, really creating a lot of integrity around our data, which we really needed to do. Every organization needs to do that. And then we really, when we started moving to self-service, started thinking about how we make everything accessible to people. And some of that stuff isn't really self-service. It's just creating a nice intake process and nice review process and nice prioritization process so people feel like their requests and needs are being heard. And also putting in some technology to get things out to people in a way that was accessible and easy for them to work with. But when we started our data, when it really chewed into self-service, we really ran into some really basic problems around that we asked ourselves, is it possible we have some data fluency issues? Is it possible that people who we're supplying data to really don't know how to navigate the dashboards or don't know how to interpret them? It's a question for us. So we did a little bit more work on this and learned about this kind of new work environment that prioritizes knowledge workers. And while most everyone in a hospital is a knowledge worker in some way, The way the corporate executive board thinks of knowledge workers are basically people who can draw meaning from spreadsheets. I mean, that's essentially, I make it super simple there. But what we're dealing with now is organizations, because of the way we're structured, they have a lot more organizational change, a lot more cross-functional work, and a really big increase in knowledge work, knowledge sharing, knowledge changing, you know, and what hospital during COVID didn't have to do a whole lot of new reporting and even new data gathering to provide the knowledge that to the leadership they needed to have to work through COVID pretty well. We've done tons of that in our hospital. I'm sure you all have too. And this survey, the survey that the Corporate Executive Board launched in, I think, 2012, it was a while ago, I admit that, only 4.2% of the whole workforce had the knowledge, had kind of the basic skills they needed to have to be a high performer in this new environment. So that's pretty low. And then when they look at healthcare in particular, they were looking, you know, kind of looked at it by level of management. You can see staff are about 25% of them seem to be able to do this well. Mid-level managers about 40%. We get up to the high group, which is the executives, and they're at about 2/3 are able to function well, according to the survey by the Corporate Executive Board, in this knowledge environment. And suddenly, when we saw these data, we're like, oh, this could be one of the challenges we're facing. So we did a baseline survey of our leadership, and this was basically anybody with a manager title, anybody who manages anybody at the hospital. So at that time, the list was about 200. We've expanded the way we define that a little bit. But anyway, we got a pretty good response rate, and all we wanted to do is assess where their comfort was and what they knew and what they didn't know, because we knew that if we were going to be successful with self-service, we needed to be able to meet them where they were at or help them get to where they needed to be. And so, you know, you can look at these metrics. Some of them are astonishing to me. That, for instance, the first one that I know the most important metrics for measuring success at the hospital was 53%. For managers, that was a little depressing for me. But when I look through these, they're really not different than what we would see in any organization across the board. There is I sometimes think that with analytics, we're at the stage we were at when people started using keyboards and, you know, just trying to figure out how to make that work. I have 2 children who recently graduated college, and they know way more about analytics, and they're liberal arts majors, way more about analytics than many mid-career leaders in most organizations. So anyway, so this is kind of some baseline stuff for you. And then another table, we actually asked about things that they could interpret and they would know how to use if they needed to. And we put a couple anchor things in here. We didn't really expect anybody to know much about multiple regression. And we sure hoped that a lot of people would feel really comfortable with graphs and visualizations, since those are used so often in our leadership meetings. And you can see where there's a lot of variability in terms of comfort and discomfort with different tools, and just basic knowledge about what these different things mean. But we all know as analysts that if we're going to provide data meaningfully, we need to be able to rely on our audience to interpret some of this. No matter what we do to make it easy for them, we need to have confidence that they can walk away with a responsible interpretation of the data. So, so we started targeting our literacy work. We decided we needed to do a lot of work on literacy, and we kind of put all of our customers in data analytics in 3 big buckets. One was independent analysts across the organization, who are sometimes working on their own in a department without anybody else to bounce ideas off of or to help them. Another bucket was leadership, which is the group we just surveyed. And then the final are the clinicians who might have some research needs on top of it. And so we really started thinking about what each of these groups needed. For the independent analysts, we started thinking that they needed an analytics home, a place where they could go with their questions, where they could reliably get good, solid software, where they could handle security questions and technical questions, and feel like they were getting the kind of information they needed. They needed mentoring and guiding. They needed higher level training or routine training. For instance, I'm sure this isn't different at most hospitals, but if you're hired in a department to be an analyst and you're not connected to IT or to analytics, whatever your centralized department is, it might be really hard for you to get Epic training and in Clarity or whatever software your hospital uses. But we basically said, if you're an analyst, we will figure out a way to pay for your training and get you trained up. And then the leadership obviously needed to learn how to interpret tables and graphs that were in front of them. Many of them knew how to do that, still needed some cleaning up there. They needed to know how to ask good critical questions so that when somebody's presenting data, they can say, how come the N on this slide is different than the N on the other slide? Just questions like that. And how to cut through some of the hype. Like many of our clinicians, they go to conferences, they see big, exciting things that vendors put out there, and they need to be able to say, okay, how would that really work in our hospital? And then clinicians really needed to focus mostly on a lot of these same things, but mostly we gear most of our training around clinicians to research questions because that is the area that they have the biggest interest. And so solutions. So I'm going to go through some big solutions. This is obviously a multi-year effort that we've been working on. And the first one is just claiming the space for expertise. We did this in a couple of ways. I started an internal blog, and we started doing co-reporting relationships throughout the hospital. But this is not to mean other people don't know how to do analytics. It's just the demands on analytics and analysts right now are so broad and so deep. Most people in healthcare know how to do a basic spreadsheet, but getting beyond that can be challenging. It's not their job, and that's okay. It's our job. But just claiming that space and saying, thank you for knowing what you know, and let us work together to improve that and to, so just kind of anchoring it and creating the centralized space for it was an important part. The other thing that we really needed to build was translators on both sides. There's this notion of light quants. These are subject matter experts around your organization who really get analytics. And I'll tell you, when we find one of these, we treasure them because they are such great translators. And when we have a complex project and we don't have one, we really feel the pain because it's very hard for us to translate, as hard as we try to translate for the subject matter experts to the analytics. And then we actually went out and hired a couple of part-time coaches, just people who are just fantastic in this work, who we worked with in a lot of ways for many years, who could kind of do some translation on our side. Not every analyst is born as a teacher or a translator, and some people are technically excellent, but really have very limited capacity to sit down with a subject matter expert and try to find that common ground so they can come up with an analytics plan. And then the fourth solution was getting standard analytic and data skill requirements in job descriptions. This was something we did through our co-reporting efforts, that when a new analyst was being hired in some department somewhere in the hospital, we would offer the opportunity to have the person co-report. And all we ask for when that co-report happens is that we have veto power over the job description, over the hire, and that person is mentored by our team. And it's very hard for people to let go of those first two things, but they've been very happy that each one of them has worked out really well. And then finally, offering analytic and data training for staff and managers. And I'll talk a little bit about what we've done today. My goal with this is really just to think about, what do typical college students come out of school knowing today, and how do we help our managers get up to that level? Okay, and so this is a rough timeline about what we've been doing. We first started our first co-reporting back in 2016, and we started some user groups then. We did our fluency survey, which you saw the results of. And then after that, once I understood kind of where the leadership was at, that's when we started our blog. Really helped us create a common language around analytics. We hired some trainer. We had hired an analytics trainer who actually helps us develop a communication plan for the end users when we release a new analytic product, which has been fantastic. We've started office hours, and that's where some of the mentoring and translation work happens. We targeted high need areas like our quality improvement and a couple of and research fellows, which they really need a lot of support. So we really targeted our office hours towards them initially, but we've expanded to the whole organization, and we offer office hours twice a week now, and a standard thing. And then we had contracted with a couple folks that we call analytics coaches. They're just people who have superior skills and can sit down and kind of chat through any analytic problem with almost anybody on the planet. So they have a great set of, they're nice little unicorns that we can fit into this. We started something called the Analytics Network in our organization to help staff and clinicians come together to learn about how to implement big analytic challenges and big, in the hospital, lots of times clinicians, as I mentioned before, will come back from a conference super excited about some new technique they learned. And this analytics network allows staff and clinicians a chance to learn about those big endeavors and learn what it takes to actually implement them together, as opposed to clinicians learning what they want and staff learning another thing. We create an environment where they learn together. And then we've started in-person training, which has been mostly focused on leaders, and will be in the fall, hopefully, or soon we'll be starting with clinical research professionals. And then I think that's it. I have a box here. Yeah, that's it for the slide, sorry. And then I just wanted to just do a little bit on, this is my last couple of slides. We did this analytics short course, which we've now taught to about 170 individuals around the organization. And it's a 5-session, 2-hour week, 2 hours each, so 10 hours of commitment. And we aimed the first one at our nurse leaders. That was a request they made of us. They were a great group to work with. And since then we've had, I think, five additional groups. So I wanted to, these slides are a little out of order, sorry about that. Let me just, so this gives you a sense of kind of the topics we deal with in our analytics training, and kind of the topic, and then what our in-person training will be focusing on. And someday I suppose we'll have check marks in all of these boxes. We haven't quite gotten there yet. But it's our overall guideline into how we try to, the topics we're trying to hit and who we're trying to hit and how we're trying to hit them. And then, so here's the class. So here's our pre and post. So the dark is pre and the post is the light color. And you can see that these are really what we're trying to teach in this class. We're not trying to turn all of our leaders into statisticians. That would be very difficult and probably not at all good for the hospital. But what we want to do is equip people to be able to manage large projects with a significant data and analytic component. And that means understanding a little bit about how analysts think and what they need in order to be productive. And so, so the pre-post really focuses on the ability to manage a project like that. And you can see that some of these areas, I apologize, some of these areas where there's less require a lot more technical skill than we're giving. You know, we're not really trying to teach people the difference between a t-test and a chi-square. We're really just trying to teach people a little bit how to approach a project in a quantitative way and in an analytic way, in order to come up with an analytic plan that can actually help them determine whether or not their project is successful. And I think that's all I have for you today. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to hearing Bridget's presentation on an actual successful launch of self-service analytics.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Let me get this going. Can you just confirm that you can see my slides and hear me, Jennifer?
Yes, I can.
Fantastic. So thank you. As Jennifer mentioned, I have a practical application of rolling out a self-service tool that I'll share with you today. And overall, while this was a technical rollout, really what I'll be sharing is some of our approaches and what we did outside of those technical steps to really get to a self-service model and be able to get to the point where we can ask some of the questions that Jennifer was just asking about how effective is this and are we getting data into the hands of the people that need it. So a bit of background to the enterprise data and analytics team here at CHOP, just to set the stage. So we really function as a center of excellence with 3 pillars across our team. So analytics includes BI development, reporting, statistics, a lot of the customer-facing roles in sharing the data. Data engineering, they handle our ETL builds, design our data warehouse, make sure all the data gets to where we need it. And then we have additional teams that make up our data trust office, so making sure that everything is flowing properly and that we have governed, trusted data in all of the end results. So very often you could say that data-driven decision-making, takes a village, and we certainly have a village here. And ultimately where we were is even with that village, we couldn't support all of the needs that were coming our way. So as that center of excellence, we had requests from every corner of the hospital, the care network, and we were the primary support for those data needs. And we had requests that just ended up in our backlog because the demand for data just so far exceeded our ability to supply it to the people asking these questions and really hungry for some data, being able to make data-driven decisions. So despite having our team and despite being able to churn out reports and dashboards and get data to people as quickly as we could, we still had that backlog of requests that resulted in long queues and long wait times and people that were itching to get their hands on data that we just couldn't meet that need. Which leads us to our target of self-service. So our goal is to take a bit of the responsibility off of us, but empower users throughout the hospital to answer their own multi-step inquiries. So this is twofold. I'll start with what we did for others. So the goal is to enable other users to really create the content that can be shared with their department, to answer some of their own questions, do their own investigation, and most importantly, be able to do that quickly and on their own. So reducing the time to delivery and insight, because if you're submitting data requests and waiting 3 to 6 months to hear back, you might not even be asking the same question you were before, which just adds you back to the queue and being able to ask for more questions. And the other side of that is for the data that was available in existing products. So in dashboards or in reports that just couldn't filter or answer the specific question that many people wanted to, the result that we see across the board far too often is exporting to Excel, building your own pivot tables, sharing those pivot tables with others, saving the final version on your desktop, and then saving the final version on your desktop. And obviously, that's not what we want as far as being able to provide trusted, governed data across the enterprise. We want to be able to share those insights more broadly and in a governed way. We'll say it will help us too. We're not just doing this for the best of everyone in the organization, but we as a data and analytics team, by reducing the one-off requests that come to us, for primarily purely access to data, we can focus on the complex, high-impact requests that really take true analysis more than querying data, putting that in a data model, and then sharing it to users. So our goal is to take our center of excellence of the data and analytics team and be able to use the expertise for those advanced problems. So with that in mind, as I mentioned, I don't want to share our technical approach for rolling out a tool, but we did have an RFP process to decide on a self-service tool. We opted for ClickSense, which is the self-service offering from Qlik that also produces QlikView. And we had a 90-day project that had the technical rollout. So we needed to spin up a production server, get security models, publish the deployment workflows, develop practices for the tool. And that was the goal of the project, was to roll out this tool. But our approach and what I want to share are pillars that weren't technical, that really we think are what made this implementation of self-service successful. So the first was our team. We had a great team. The BI developers, really who you would expect to be on a project like this. They have the direct experience with the end users. They're the ones fulfilling data requests, building the dashboards, and kind of know what it needs to look like and how it needs to function. But we didn't have just a team of BI developers and admins on the team. We really pulled from all different elements of the data and analytics team as a whole. So we included data engineering, which will support the data-first approach that I'll speak to a bit later. And tied with that, we had data governance in a tool rollout from the very beginning, which I think is a pretty uncommon approach to starting a new self-service reporting tool and having data governance in all of those early conversations. But I think this was really important for designing the standards of governance and trust for this new community of self-service from the very beginning and every step of the way for our workflows, for our processes, and for our expectations of the users. And tying it all together, we had our application administrator and our solution architect, or our workflow guru, that have made everything flow seamlessly from beginning to end. So once we had the team, the first thing we actually did was define what we wanted self-service to be. We knew what our target state was, but self-service means tons of different things in tons of different contexts. And that's why a session like this today could be hours long as everyone brings their own approach. So some different definitions that we've seen, some are purely practical definitions. So they specify the actions that occur in a self-service model. Some other tools define self-service based on their user roles, or even claim that user roles don't matter because data needs to be accessible to everyone, and that's what self-service means. So ultimately, it's a very wide spectrum. We ended up somewhere in the middle, and actually our goal and our definition of self-service aligned pretty closely with the Gartner definition, which is taking a user-centric approach and providing a framework that lowers the barrier to entry. So empowering the end users to create and share reports on their own, but providing an enterprise-supported structure and tools to do that within. So giving them the guidelines, but then expanding the capabilities. That way, it's not all on the data and analytics team, but it's also not throwing brand new data-driven individuals off the deep end with no lifeline. So we had the team, we had our goal, a couple principles of implementation that we kept in mind that I do want to take the time to walk through, because these were really core to how we were thinking about those technical elements. So the first is an easy to learn process and workflow on top of the tool. So we had the tool, as you can see from the image here, it's pretty approachable. You can drag and drop, and you don't need to code. There isn't anything that would scare users away. And that was really important because we knew that we pretty much had one shot to get this right. That even if the tool itself was approachable, if the process you needed to go through to get access, or the workflow to publish your reports and share it with others, if that was very complicated, we'd lose people right away, and our community of self-service users just wouldn't be able to grow and would be back to the same place we were, of people exporting to Excel, of people sharing screenshots, of people not being able to access their data. So whether it was a security model, making sure that the right people could see the right data, or who we trained as a user, all of that had to do with making sure that the workflow was approachable to anyone that would want to get involved and had the skill set to get involved. The next was separating local and enterprise analytics. So we defined two different primary use cases of teams that would use this self-service reporting tool. So the first we termed as local. So a local team develops products specifically for their small group, often focused on data sets that they own and pretty much stay within the group. So one example of one of our local teams is our digital marketing team. They work with a ton of third-party vendors. They have Excel files that they only receive as Excel files, but need to integrate with our data warehouse. And they are the experts in that data. and know how to use it, but didn't have a tool to effectively report it and summarize it and be able to explore on their own. So in this case, ClickSense met that need, and they could be a local team that we gave them the tool, gave them the framework, and sent them off running. The other side of this was enterprise analytics. So in this case, enterprise products didn't necessarily mean that they were used by or even applicable to the entire organization, but they used shared data elements, metrics, or definitions that would be shared with leaders or had a very broad audience or needed to be the single source of truth for a specific team. And so therefore had a governance review and approval before any publication happened. So if you have an enterprise product and you're going to develop it with our new self-service tool, you still needed to have it approved so that way we had the data trust in all of the products that were out there. But by separating the local teams and these enterprise teams that we wanted to provide the additional reviews and governance structure within, we were able to address the problem and that problem statement of reducing the time to insights. Because if we didn't define the possibility for these local teams that had everything they needed to function, we'd be right back where we started of having a backlog of governance reviews and people coming from all corners of the hospital, now with their own developed products that still needed to be vetted before they were released. So by separating these, it cut into what the data and analytics team needed to be involved in, while also providing that structure that we had in our definition of self-service and the support for that single source of truth in the apps that were developed. And finally, I think personally, I would say this one was the biggest one for us, is that we needed to make sure, however we rolled this out and however we communicated this tool, that development needed to be data first. And what I mean by that is that the data should exist in our database level and shouldn't have logic or specific business rules stored in the individual apps. And this really was required for consistency and trust, as I mentioned, across this new community of users that we're going to start to be able to get to their own insights. We needed to make sure that it was foolproof for them to get to the key metrics. So at CHOP, we have a curated, integrated data layer called the CHOP blocks, not to be confused with the chopping blocks, different thing. We do love the CHOP blocks. And these curated data sit on top of our data warehouse. So really, they're synthesizing mostly data from Clarity out of Epic, but they contain simplified, governed, and widely used data elements. And our goal here is that the 20% of data elements that are most used and answer 80% of the questions, that's what exists in our CHOP blocks. So in rolling out this tool, teaching new developers how to use it, we don't want them necessarily going to Epic and the underlying Chronicles and Clarity data elements. We want to introduce them to this curated data layer right away, make sure that this is integrated in every part of the education and the rollout of the tool. So that way, when someone goes to an app that they created themselves to get the count of visits that were completed yesterday, and then they go to another app that was created by one of their peers to get the count of visits yesterday, that better be the same number. And we do that by making sure that the data is really foolproof for especially these new users at the database level. So I mentioned very briefly in the background kind of where we were before this rollout. And where we were is that we only had 2 roles when it came to data exploration and data insights, and that was the app consumer and the developer. And developers generally required the skill set of what is typically termed a data analyst. They know SQL, they understand the intricacies of a database, they know the technical elements of being able to do some advanced BI builds. And if that role wasn't fulfilled within an individual skill set, really everyone else was lumped into the consumer role. So there was this hard line drawn between the two. And it was very difficult for anyone outside of our data and analytics team to go from a consumer to a developer, even if they did have data literacy and data understanding and the skill set to make it almost all the way there. if, say, coding was a barrier that they couldn't get through, they couldn't previously really be a developer and contribute to the analytics products that were released. So redefining it, there's really two big steps that we had in redefining these roles. The first is, you can see we added the contributor in the middle. So the contributor, as I think to steal Jennifer's term, it's anyone that's comfortable in Excel. So if you're the person that's making your own pivot tables and you're comfortable that clicking and dragging and knowing what a dimension versus a row and a column is, you can be a contributor. And rather than doing that offline in Excel to answer your own questions behind the scene, you're actually contributing to these apps that are published. They're on the server for others to see. So that way, the creations that you have, whether it's a trending chart or a specific table or data filtered a certain way, is always there for you to go back to. It's not extracted. And potentially, most importantly, your peers then can also see that view. So if you're asking a question about how no-shows are impacting your visits and your peer division isn't asking that question yet, they can actually see these contributors' visuals and tables and start asking their own questions themselves. So really expanding that knowledge and, again, not having it all on the data and analytics team to create those pathways to insights. So in addition to the contributor, as part of this self-service model built on top of the chop blocks with an easy-to-use tool, the other big difference is that all of these levels are now available to all users. You don't need to be a coder or a data analyst by title to be an app developer. So that barrier to entry is significantly reduced, and by spreading out kind of the responsibilities over these three roles, we've created a pathway to level up. So it is very possible, and exactly what we want, for a consumer to become confident and ask the right questions to be a contributor, for a contributor to eventually be very comfortable with the tool and move into development. So what this actually looks like, of course, it's different even within CHOP. We can't put blanket statements on who a developer is and who a contributor is, because every division has their own approach and interest and data savviness. But a couple really key wins that we had immediately after this rollout, which went live this February. There's one developer. He works in our access services area as a manager, and he was our really subject matter expert for a specific ClickView, an existing dashboard that we had. And he knew a little bit about SQL and was able to provide updates and changes and recommendations. But really, he was submitting to requests and almost had a dedicated data analyst within our team who was helping to support this main app for him to be able to track how many calls were coming in through the access center of the patients trying to come in for care. He was really the primary person for tracking all of that data, and previously would come to us with all the requests. He's now a developer. I don't think we've heard questions from him in quite a while, and even more importantly, he's answering other people's questions about how to access data and how to build your own self-service tools. And he has his own 3 published apps that really were independent from our data and analytics team, but have that governed review and control, so that way they have that data trust in production. And similarly, within the Department of Pediatrics, I can say personally that I got a ton of requests previously about all of the people that were asking great questions, and they were all the right questions of being able to dive into the data and slice and dice it every which way. And now a lot of those practice managers and business managers that previously were asking me for Excel spreadsheet after Excel spreadsheet after Excel spreadsheet, they're now contributors. They're creating their own custom visuals in our production tool. They don't have the data in spreadsheet. They don't need refreshes 5 times as they're preparing for a big upcoming meeting. They have that latest data. And so practice managers can now create their own visuals and have those published. So coming out of this, we did have the successful rollout. I will say that one of the few blessings in disguise of COVID and the pandemic is that usage took off because, as Jennifer mentioned, everyone had new questions and needed new sets of data. So one of the few fortunate things is this happened right after our rollout of this new self-service tool. So really, we've skyrocketed our user community, truthfully, much faster than we were anticipating. And we have 132 trained contributors and 99 developers, including our central data and analytics team, covering 55 different content areas in the hospital. So that's in combining the local and the enterprise teams, and really 55 different content areas are using this self-service tool and having embedded contributors and developers contributing back their content and analytics products. So other next steps are really expanding the clinical user pool more. We did find that the early adopters were the administrators, those managers, the business managers, practice managers. On the administrative side, kind of those that were very often in Excel anyway were our first adopters. But we do know that there are clinical users that want to see this data also. So expanding into the clinical side, definitely something we're looking to do through things like training programs of data literacy, understanding the data platform. So those chop blocks that have the curated data, make sure everyone knows how to use them. And then also training in that reporting tool that we rolled out in February. And last element, something that will never go away in the best way, is continuing to build those chop blocks. So that curated data layer, we want to make sure that it is answering as many questions as possible while still being approachable and containing the right amount of data. So we have also implemented, and we could have our data engineers speak about this for another hour, but we want others to contribute to the chop blocks in the same way that they're contributing visuals and tables to our reporting tools. So if they realize that they're always asking for another field that isn't in this curated data model, we want them to propose that and get that data into the chop blocks, into that layer that the most self-service users are comfortable with. That way we can just continue to expand the types of questions that those new self-service community members can ask, and expand the usage overall. So that's where we are. I believe that's all I have.
Okay, we have a couple questions for Bridget. Do you think it's necessary to establish standard analytic methods for generally common questions or requests within your team?
I would, my past consulting might come out, and we might get a lot of it depends, because I think there's always a lot of it depends with self-service. So I think on one hand, having standards is definitely something that helps with consistency and governance. And one of our primary focuses from our data and analytics team currently are actually have enterprise supported service line dashboards. So one of the things that our data and analytics team is still doing and is holding on to are creating this highest level, most highly governed view of those key metrics. So I think having that standardized view, there's definitely advantages of having the service line dashboards be consistent across the different areas of the hospital, and definitely helps with the governance and the trust in that sense. That being said, I think one of the powers of self-service is that you can also put the power in the hands of the people and let people explore it in their own ways. So there's definitely value in having even a metric that might be in our highly governed service line dashboard also be available for others to explore on their own. That way they can add a new filter or slice and dice a different way.
Can you discuss measures you may or could use to monitor the success of your self-service analytic efforts?
Sure, that one to me too?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, so I can share a bit about what we were looking at during our pilot, so during this actual rollout, and then what we've done since. So during the rollout, we did have a pilot group of users that were similar to the examples that I shared on that last slide of the user stories. So these people that were asking us tons of questions and bothering us in the best way possible, they were really our pilot group of what can you figure out on your own. So one of our key metrics is really how much does the backlog of data requests shrink? So how much can people that were emailing us, putting in IS tickets, asking for that data, how much can they now do on their own? So that was a really key metric, especially in the beginning with our pilot users, of understanding what were you asking before that was going to be on our central team that you can now access. Since then, we've been very focused on community growth. So who's getting trained as a developer, as a contributor, in what content areas, and then also who's active in those roles. So our data governance team is looking to create a community of data stewardship of those people that are actively involved in the self-service tool. How much are they contributing? How much are they adding to those tools? And then also, what's the size of that active community?
Great. Another question for you, Bridget. What was the drag and drop reporting tool you're using?
Yeah, we're using ClickSense. So the RFP, the request for proposal that we had included Sisense, Power BI, Tableau, and ClickSense, I believe, were the top 4. And ultimately, we went with ClickSense for a number of reasons. Primarily, it's browser-based, so you don't need to install software in order to develop. And also, it complements, we were using ClickView as a previous reporting tool. So coming from the same company, those paired nicely together.
Okay, I have a question for Jennifer. What's next for the Lori data literacy work?
I think a lot. Our biggest effort right now is around clinical research professionals who at our hospital have a huge variety of skills that they bring to the job and also expectations from them. And so that's an area where we think that there's a lot of benefit for us investing some work. Also, that's a group that tends to only be at the hospital for a few years, and then they move on to grad school or med school. And so it's a group that's constantly churning, and they actually put a lot of demands on our team. And then I think the other area we would continue working in is in the leadership area, and trying to just to build some kind of help them implement some of the planning tools that we teach in the Leading with Analytics course.
I have another question for Bridget. What is the process if an analysis that was developed under local governance is used for enterprise decisions? What's the approval process like?
Yeah, so definitely something that we've had to address is we've had local teams that we set up, we said, great, you're good to go, you have access and the support and the team that you need. But then they kind of want to branch over into enterprise. So we have a few enticing things to pull people into the enterprise analytics of if they're reporting to leadership, or if they're reporting externally to the hospital, or if this particular dashboard or set of data products are used as the single source of truth. In that case, we then look to really encourage that team to move to enterprise analytics. And for the team themselves, so for our self-service users, we made that as seamless as possible. That's something that's a conversation we can have. Either we notice their usage has gone up, or they say, we want some extra governance, we want someone to review this, we want to be confident in what we're reporting out. Then we on our end can just make their ClickSense uses streams, which are folders that published products can be moved into. We can then add the governance layer on top of that. So the process for the end users doesn't change at all as far as developing or publishing content. There's just that extra review process that's added before the published apps are then available to the other users, so that way data governance can review. So it's very much a conversation about which side of local versus the enterprise a specific team and set of products fall on. But then the user experience, we then tried to keep as consistent as possible. So it's just in our workflows that we have that extra approval and sign off required before the publication occurs.
Great. Okay, I have another question for Jennifer. Do you use similar or different metrics than those Bridget described for success of self-service?
So, right, we do use those metrics. We also just look at utilization of our self-service tools. I will say that we have not seen a decrease in our one-off requests. They continue to pile up. And in fact, I think they've gone up 40% since we really started moving into self-service. So I think what happens though is that they're better and more focused requests. But I do think that nobody ever asks for less information. And so they learn what they learn in their self-service in the self-service tools we supply, and then they just have more questions, and we have to figure out how to meet those. But I do think they're more focused.
If I could jump in with one more addition to that to piggyback off Jennifer, I think something else that we were a little prepared for, but probably not as prepared as we needed to be, were the support for new developers and contributors. So we lowered the barrier to entry. We got people that were 90% of the way there in and trained. But now instead of asking for a specific data set as an export, the questions were, I'm a newly trained developer. I think I know where I'm pulling all this table from. Can you help me set up my model? So I think that sort of support was really important to come in, which was cheating a bit as far as counting our data requests, because the requests, as Jennifer just mentioned, changed a bit. They weren't asking for data, but the support that we needed to provide at this point in the early self-service areas were about getting those new content creators really off the ground and off and running.
Okay, I have a question for either or both of you. What kind of initial executive leadership support and ongoing engagement was required prior to culture change?
Bridget, you want to go, or you want me to go?
After you.
Well, after the hospital moved to its new location, we just built a new hospital 7 years ago, a new building. And after we moved, the hospital decided there were 3 areas that, because we were so distracted with building the new hospital, that we had fallen behind on. And one of those areas was analytics. And so we received a lot of support initially. You know, our team was initially like 6 people. I was on the research side. They pulled me over to run it. And so we really were starting really from scratch. Not that those 6 people weren't doing great work. And so, so we developed a roadmap then that all of the leadership bought into, that has been an incredibly useful tool. We went through a several-month process where we listened and developed consensus about how we would roll out what analytics would look like at our hospital. And that has really, we have gotten just great support, because I think everybody really had a say. And they also knew that we were trying to do things in an affordable way. We understood that you could, you know, spend $1 gazillion, but we didn't have $1 gazillion to spend. So I think that initial roadmap, which gets tweaked every year or so, just continues to keep our leadership on our side. And they have been incredibly supportive. In fact, when I first mentioned the whole idea of, I was concerned about literacy and fluency, and I just mentioned it to the woman who was then our chief nursing officer, and she said, yes, please start with the nurses. So, and now she's our COO, and so she's been a huge support to us.
Yeah, I would say that the increase in data-driven decisions really came from the highest level. I won't be able to quote it directly, but I know that analytics was included in CHOP's enterprise plan as a goal to incorporate those data-driven decisions into every element of the hospital. So with that kind of guiding principle, that further led to the situation we were in of everyone wanted data because leadership was telling them that data is the way to go. So I would say that the highest level of leadership really led to our need for self-service. And so then therefore, since self-service reduced that time to insight and did increase the access to it, that kind of trickled down through all levels of management within our analytics and reporting teams specifically, just because there's been such a drive across the entire industry, I'm sure not just at CHOP, but just to make those decisions to be data-driven. And then more recently, since our rollout, we've seen, as I mentioned, COVID was the whirlwind of data requests and new reporting. And I think the exposure that the self-service tools specifically and the data and analytics team received because of those responses and because of the executive briefings where that sort of data was shared, I think the need for this expanded data community has really been driven at every level of the hospital.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. If we weren't able to address all of them, I can send them to the presenters afterward via email. Okay, question for Jennifer. Is your data literacy training curriculum Lurie specific or generalizable to hospital analytics? If so, would it be easy to build shared curriculum?
Yeah, I think it's very easy. I mean, so just to pull back the curtain, so I taught program evaluation at a master's level program for a number of years, and I pulled a lot of that content and just figured out how to apply it to the hospital and to the questions that were burning for our people. I really simplified it, really pulled it back. So that's really what a lot of the leadership training is around, is how to kind of evaluate your own, how to know that you're successful in whatever you're doing. And that has been, that is available online. A lot of that is the basis of the Y-Axis blog, which was originally internal and that is now external. And so, yeah, absolutely. We try really hard to make it applicable to people in children's hospitals, just because that's our audience and we want to make sure that they see how it's applicable to them. But really, the principles of this can apply in any domain.
Great, I think our time is up. And if we didn't get to your questions, I will send them to the presenters and they'll reach out to you. Thank you very much. We are going to be adding this, a video of this session as well as the previous sessions to a YouTube channel, and we'll send out more information about that via the PEDS Analytics site.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Shannon.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer and Bridget. Bye-bye.